hold on to God's unchanging hand, because He helped Joshua fight the battle of Jericho. Yes, He helped Daniel get out the lion's den. He helped Hurricane get off the island. Lord.
All right, A-Push scholars, Mr. Beamer here. Welcome to our last video for Chapter 5. And actually, this is our last video that covers period 2, 1607 to 1754. We wanted to thank the introductory soundbite from the movie Coming to America. Your parents might have liked that movie. I've seen it over 50 times. Love that movie. And I think it applies to this video because we're going to talk a lot about religion today. All right, so this is the second half of Chapter 5, pages 92 to 101, and we're going to continue talking about colonial society on the eve of the Revolution. And here are the key topics down here. Religion is going to be the biggest issue, tied in with the First Great Awakening. One of the most famous court trials in colonial America, the Zenger trial, and also a little bit about politics. Okay, the first section of reading is on dominant denominations, and so religion is the big theme for this video. The two most popular churches in colonial America were the Anglicans and the Congregational Church. Okay, we'll talk a lot about these. The Anglican Church is also basically the Church of England, so you need to know that these two are basically the same churches. The people in the colonies that followed the Anglican Church also followed the Church of England. And it was popular mostly in the South, okay, in Georgia, the Carolinas, Virginia, and Maryland, and some parts of New York. The first college founded by the Anglican Church is William and Mary College in Virginia in 1693. We should know that the first college ever in America was Harvard in 1636, and that was founded by the Puritans. Okay, in New England, the church was called the Congregational Church. So the Puritans, their church eventually evolves into the Congregational Church, and both the Anglican and the Congregational Church were supported by taxes. Okay, so they were supported by the government, and we should know that a couple groups did not like paying taxes for churches, especially in Rhode Island and also in Pennsylvania. And the third denomination that you need to know are the Presbyterians. The Presbyterians were located more in the back country. They were third in popularity, and many of the followers were Scots-Irish immigrants. And they, like the Quakers and also Rhode Island, did not believe in supporting the church through taxes, and so they were not supported by the government. And some of the ministers in all the denominations did preach on political issues, which today does not usually happen. Right, continuing this section, a famous phrase is Congregationalism, Presbyterianism, and rebellion are the neo-trinity. They go hand in hand, these three things. So the people in the Northeast and also the back country, they were the ones that supported rebellion the most against the British in the 1770s. However, many of the supporters of the Anglican Church, especially in the South and in New York, supported the king and the English government. So they were probably the least supportive of the revolution in the 1770s. Also, only 25,000 Catholics were in America by 1775. Many of those, of course, came to Maryland in the 1600s. And more religious toleration did occur in the colonies than in Europe. Okay, Europe, especially England, was pretty much just the Church of England. That was the main religion of England. The colonies had three different denominations: the Congregationalists, Anglicans, and the Presbyterians. Okay, we'll look at this map again later, but let's just look at, again, the three main churches in the colonies: the Anglican, the Congregational Church, and also the Presbyterian. Lutherans are on here. We'll talk about those a little bit later. Anglicans, you see, are in this color, and most of them are located in the South and also into parts of New York. Congregational Church, of course, is up in New England, and the Presbyterian is more in the back country. Okay, now a couple of them are dotted along the coast, but many of them are located along the back country. Okay, the next section is on the Great Awakening, and this is maybe the biggest colonial event in A-Push, along with maybe Bacon's Rebellion, before we get to the French and Indian War. Okay, so this is the first spontaneous mass movement in the colonies, and it touched really all the colonies. And the key thing with the First Great Awakening is liberal ideas began to challenge old-time religion. So religion was being challenged, and during this time period, it starts in Massachusetts with a guy named Jonathan Edwards, is one of the big revivalists. And another name you need to know as well is George Whitefield. These are two incredible speakers during this time period, and I think the key connection is emotion. Religion became more emotional to the American colonists, and so they got more excited about religion, and there was a split and there was conflict, as in many churches, between the old lights, those who wanted things the way they were, and now the new lights. These are the people that wanted the emotion, they wanted the change. Right here are the images of Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield, interesting looking characters. And I think you need to know those two names. Those two men were incredible speakers. George Whitefield was such a powerful speaker that he made Ben Franklin, thrifty Ben Franklin, actually put some money in the collection plate at church. Another side note, George Whitefield was England. He came over to America to preach, and he does have ties to the Church of England. So many of his sermons would have been in the South and in the New York region. Let's continue. So the old guard felt undermined. Okay, these two guys were new lights. These were not the old-time religion. These were new religious figures. And a key thing is more denominations did develop because of the First Great Awakening. Okay, we'll look at the map a little bit later. And it did surprisingly encourage some missionary work among Native Americans. So instead of trying to remove them and kill them, there was a look to convert them to Christianity. And like Harvard and eventually William and Mary, the First Great Awakening did lead to more colleges being created, especially Princeton, Brown, Rutgers, Dartmouth, and a few of these become part of the Ivy League in history. And finally, another important result of the Great Awakening was the breakdown of sectional boundaries. So what does this mean? It means that the counties started to feel somewhat united because of this. So in New York, the Great Awakening was going there, but also in Georgia. And so there's a common bond. So now the colonists, instead of feeling separated and isolated, felt more of a part of something and became more American. Okay, last I just want to look at this map again. Just look at, we got Anglican, we've got the Presbyterian, the back country in orange, and we have the Congregationalists in pink. The black squares here, these are all Baptists, and this resulted partially because of the First Great Awakening. And so some of these people used to be part of the Anglican Church, but they turned to become Baptist. And in red, you see some of the Catholic people dotted throughout the counties. Again, we have a few in Maryland. Okay, the next section is schools and colleges, and we've already kind of talked about this a little bit, but New England was the most committed of any region to education. We know that the Puritans wanted their children to read so they can read the Bible, and thus they would not be swayed by other religions. And we already talked about that. And so boys in New England attended primary and secondary schools, so there's definitely more education in New England than in the South. There was some education in the middle and southern colonies, but nowhere near what it was like in New England. In the South, especially the wealthy families, the large planters, did have opportunities to send their children to private schools or give them tutors to help with their studies. Many of the wealthy families actually sent their kids to England to go to college there. Unfortunately, we know that there was a big division between social classes in the South, and the poorer classes did not really send their kids to schools because there was no public education at that time. Okay, and finishing up this section, here are the 9 colleges, and I don't think you need to remember all of them. I would definitely know Harvard, though, was in Massachusetts. It was founded by the Puritans in 1636. I think William and Mary is also important because that was the first Southern college to promote the Church of England or the Anglican Church. And the rest of these colleges were formed mostly for religious purposes. And also Rutgers is now part of the Big Ten. And lastly, the bottom line here, 6 of the 9 were established after what? So 1746, 51, and so on. All these colleges occurred after the First Great Awakening. I keep saying First Great Awakening. There had to have been a second one, right? There was. And the Second Great Awakening happened 100 years later in the 1830s and 1840s. As always, we want you to look at documents. They're so important to read, and they're also very interesting. And so here's one on page 95. How do you feel about this sermon by Jonathan Edwards? I'm going to read it to you now. The God that holds you over the pit of hell, much as one holds a spider or some loathsome insect over the fire, abhors you and is dreadfully provoked. His wrath toward you burns like fire. He looks upon you as worthy of nothing else but to be cast into the fire. Yeah, I don't know how to respond to that one, except I think the guy, Jonathan Edwards, I think he needs a hug. He needs a hug because he's got some issues, but fire up. There's fire again. All right, the next section is culture in the backwoods, and colonists spent their extra time on religious and political issues. That was probably their biggest issues for the colonists, especially politics. They became very good at that. The arts, engineering, science, medicine was not a big issue in the colonies. If there was some architecture being involved during this time period, it was a lot like England. Literature is not that important yet. It is important, but not that yet for the colonists. Literature doesn't really become a big issue until around the year 1820 when we start to have our own uniquely American authors. The most cultured American was Ben Franklin. He was labeled the first civilized American. He wrote Poor Richard's Almanac in the 1750s, and he did have a big influence in shaping the American character, one of the most important people in American history, and he is going to be around, thankfully, for the Revolution and also for the Constitution as well. And as I mentioned, science was limited and not a big issue and not very precise. Franklin, of course, we talk about, the rumor is he discovered electricity with his kite, and he might have been the most interested or most well-known of American scientists. But he was more well-known for his political greatness. Okay, the next section is pioneer presses, and the printing press is developed shortly before the colonial time period, and this allows for more and more information to be available to the public, and more Americans were reading, and so they wanted to get as much information as possible. They especially learned to read more in New England, and so this allows more colonial newspapers to be created, and so because we have so many of them, that actually helps the revolution get going because more and more people can read about the problems that the colonists were facing, especially in Boston. And finally, a key event in APUSH you need to know is the Zenger trial. It's named after John Peter Zenger. It happened in the year 1734, pretty much right around the time of the First Great Awakening. Anyway, so the story goes, this is a newspaper printer in New York, and he's charged with libel, basically making up false stories, and he was found not guilty by the courts. And so this is a first precedent for freedom of the press. We know that that is a belief in America today, and this begins with the John Peter Zenger trial. Unfortunately, sometimes our newspapers get a little bit too far, and they kind of print things that may not be true, and so I'm pretty sure this didn't happen. I'm pretty sure. Okay, as I mentioned earlier, Americans were great in politics. They love to argue. They love to talk about government. And, of course, the cradle of democracy we mentioned before was the tavern, where many of the politicians and government officials would get together and talk about the government. The setup of the counties were similar, so let's talk about that. Most counties did have a royal governor, and that means this person was appointed by the king. So this person was from England, so they were not necessarily from America. So the colonists didn't really like that a whole lot, but they did have a two-house legislature. Most of the counties had this, so they had a lower house elected directly by the people. You should make the connection to today with the House of Representatives. Our Congress has two houses, a lower and an upper, and the lower house is the House of Representatives. Getting back to the royal governors, some of them were good, but some of them were very incompetent and very corrupt, and they were appointed by the king, like I mentioned. And so this fact right here made the colonists distrust the royal governors and not like that person, which led to more conflict. And eventually this has become a big issue during the Revolution. Okay, a little breakdown of the local government. Town meetings, I would highlight this, become popular in New England. And this is where the Revolution really takes off, is in New England, especially around Boston. These town meetings were a way for the leaders to discuss the political climate in their colony. In the South, town meetings were not as popular because they had county governments, mostly because of the South being so spread out, because of the larger farms, the plantations. So people did not discuss very much politics in the South. Another important point, and we've already talked about this before, is that religion or property qualifications were needed to vote. So first of all, you had to be a man, and in New England, you had to be part of the church, or pretty much everywhere else, you had to own land. Okay, and so to vote, you have to have these qualifications. And this continues, especially the property qualification continues into the 1820s. Even with this limitation on democracy with property qualifications, by the Revolution, 1775, we were more democratic than England and Europe. So again, that is a positive, although it was not quite as democratic as maybe some Americans wanted. And finally, the final section is colonial folkways, and this kind of ties into the theme of ideas, beliefs, and culture. And colonists overall had a better life than most people in Europe, mostly because of the land available, but there was a little bit more leisure time as well to have fun, to dance, especially in the South. They like to dance there. And there was some military training in the colonies. especially the Minutemen in New England, and they're going to be important, especially at the beginning of the Revolution. Lotteries, we read about them before with the Puritans, were common to raise money for churches or schools. So finally, let's look at some characteristics of the colonies. Again, we're generalizing here. They all 13 had their differences. However, all of them did speak English, and they were all mostly Protestant. There was only 25,000 Catholics by 1775 for the most part. The big three religions were definitely Protestant. And for the most part, there was religious and ethnic toleration throughout the colonies. Probably less so in New England. They were pretty much strictly wanted just the Congregational church to dominate, but especially in Pennsylvania and Rhode Island, we saw this. And there was some self-government, okay, where there was the people did rule themselves, especially those with that own property. But again, this is a belief in the American colonies that they have the right to rule themselves. And then in 1760s, when England tries to take away some of their self-government, we have a revolution on our hands.